In history we know Henry VIII most famously for his 6 wives. He is the most famous English king, but 2 of his wives met their end inside the walls of the Tower of London in brutal fashion. Both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard faced death on Tower Green in front of a small group of witnesses. However, their bodies at one point were lost throughout the centuries. Following beheadings on Tower Green, the remains of the condemned were taken into the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. If this happened on Tower Hill, they were then brought back inside the tower's walls. However, the small chapel throughout history went through a number of different renovations. Queen Victoria commented even on the state of the chapel, and renovations were then made. However, this then discovered the body of one of England's most famous queens, Anne Boleyn. So join us today as we look at the desecration of Anne Boleyn's grave, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, fell sharply from grace in a downfall expertly calculated by Thomas Cromwell. Henry VIII and Anne married in January 1533 after being married in secret months earlier, and the marriage caused chaos with Henry then separating from the Roman Catholic Church. This plunged England into religious turmoil, but following a number of miscarriages and disappointments with regards to having a son, Henry VIII's eyes turned against Anne towards Jane Seymour. By March 1536, Henry was courting Jane, and to marry her, he had to find a reason to end his marriage with Anne. He placed Thomas Cromwell in charge of finding a way out of the marriage, and Henry had Anne investigated for high treason, before on the 2nd of May 1536 she was sent to the Tower of London and placed on trial. She was convicted of incest, treason and adultery, and then on the 19th of May 1536 was executed. Anne was kept inside the tower for a number of days, and then on the day of her execution was brought to Tower Green, where it was said, "She gracefully addressed the people from the scaffold, with a voice somewhat overcome by weakness, which gathered strength as she went on. She begged them to pray for the king, in whom she had always found great kindness. The spectators could not refrain from tears." After saying farewell to her ladies-in-waiting, she was faced with the executioner on the scaffold, which sat right next to the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. The expert swordsman from France then performed his duty, striking off Anne's head with a single stroke to the shock of those witnesses. Many across England believed Anne would go on to become a queen in heaven, including Thomas Cromwell, a key supporter. Usually the remains of those executed inside the tower and on Tower Hill were placed into an arrow chest and then buried inside the chapel St Peter ad Vincula. The church itself is a Tudor chapel and is the burial place of many of the Tower of London's most famous prisoners. It is the resting place of Anne and also Catherine Howard, along with Lady Jane Grey, her husband Lord Guildford, George Boleyn and many more. Anne was the second person laid to rest in front of the high altar of the chapel during the Tudor period and the reign of Henry VIII. 13 men and women of note would follow her and her brother to their graves inside the chancel of the building. Now, dying of treason led to the individual usually being left with no celebration or gravestone. The resting places were not marked, and this was similar with Anne's, however a register was kept of her burial. A Tudor chronicler wrote at the time of another execution, "Their corpses with the heads were buried in the chapel in the tower, at the high altar." The plan of interments inside of the chancel show that Anne Boleyn's grave lay to the left of the altar, and after Anne and George's burials, more followed in the Tudor period. However, over the next 200 years, the chapel fell into a rather poor state of disrepair, a place certainly not fit for a royal burial. Various additions had reduced the building to a condition more resembling that of a neglected and insignificant parish church, and one visitor even stated of his disgust at the barbarous stupidity that transformed the little church into a meeting house. It was during the reign of Queen Victoria that large-scale restorations occurred at the chapel. Victoria, upon visiting the chapel, ordered that improvements were to be made, not just to the decor, but also to the heating systems. Plans were made to restore the chapel, but during the restoration work, there was a significant amount of desecration of some of the most high-profile graves. The pavement of the church had sunk and become uneven, and when the flagstones of the chapel were lifted, it was found that those bodies buried within the walls of the chapel during the Tudor period and Stuart period had repeatedly become desecrated. All of the remains were found beneath the floor of the chapel, and they were collected and enclosed within boxes with inscriptions to identify them, and then the coffins were taken from the crypt. The floor was then relaid, but at this point the area in front of the altar where Anne Boleyn lay had been left. It was planned to leave the chancel alone, but then changes meant that the exhumation of Anne Boleyn needed to go ahead. On the 9th of November 1876, whilst people went about their normal lives outside the walls of the Tower of London, those inside the chapel were about to exhume the body of a queen who had been laid to rest over 300 years before. At around 12:30, 5 men were gathered in front of the high altar, and using a plan of the known burials, they located Anne's remains and began to excavate. They began by lifting the pavement and removing the earth, one spade at a time, and they dug to around a depth of 2 feet before the remains were found. The bones had all heaped together in one spot, however disturbingly the grave had already been tampered with before. Anne Boleyn's grave had been disturbed by the collapsing and decaying coffin of a 54-year-old woman named Hannah Beresford, who had been buried in a similar spot in 1750. It was decided that the cause of the pavement collapse was this burial, and that it had also disturbed Anne's burial. A surgeon, Dr. Frederick J. Moat, along with his team carefully and forensically recorded Anne's remains. He then said, "A female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one jaw in the atlas, which was next to the skull, and they bore the witness of the Queen's little neck." A later, more thorough examination concluded, "The bones of the head indicate a well-formed rounded skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show their depth and roundness of the chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, and tampering fingers with a narrow foot. All of the men who helped to exhume Anne's body were sure it was a female body, and after the remains were exhumed, they carefully handed them over to the governor of the Tower. He then stored them inside of his house, the Queen's House, and 2 days later more bodies were found, including Jane Rochford and Margaret Pole. Anne's bones showed that she was around 5 foot or 5'3", and it confirmed death by beheading. It was 5 months later that her body would return to its resting place. On Friday the 13th of April 1877, 7 men at midday, including the resident chaplain of the chapel, gathered inside of the chancel. This time it was to lay the bodies to rest in specifically made caskets. Each of these were made from thick lead and were held together with copper screws in boxes made of oak plank, around 1 inch in their thickness. An etching was made on the coffins with their names and the years they died, with the date of reinterment on also. A note was made of the burials, and a decorative floor outlined the location of the graves, and specifically Anne's. Some people still debate about whether it was Anne Boleyn's body that was located. However, today, poignantly, it is a site of pilgrimage for many who intend to have a quiet moment of reflection inside of the tower. Recently, on a visit to the Tower of London, whilst alone inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, it was rather moving to see a beefeater or yeoman warder knelt inside of the chancel, beneath the grave of Anne Boleyn, having minutes of prayer and reflection. Anne is seen by many today as a martyr, and a woman whose life was stolen from her by the scheming of men such as Thomas Cromwell, who condemned her to death with no justice. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.